For over 125 years, a single American family has wielded a power greater than most presidents or tycoons. They don't command armies or control industries. They control the first draft of history. This is the Ochs-Sulzberger family, the unelected dynasty behind the New York Times. For 5 generations, they have been the custodians of an institution that has served as the nation's mirror, its chronicler, and often its conscience. Their public story is a saga of ambition and the relentless pursuit of truth. While the Times' legacy is marked by Pulitzer Prizes and headline scoops, there are documented personal sacrifices, financial risk, long hours, and social pressures faced by the Ochs-Sulzberger family. New York City in the 1890s was the age of brazen, yellow journalism, dominated by 2 giants, Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World and William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal. Their weapons were sensational headlines, fabricated stories, and fanning the flames of public outrage, most infamously plunging the United States into the Spanish-American War. They were manipulative, clever, and incredibly profitable. And in the shadow of these giants, a once proud institution was fading. By 1896, the New York Times, founded in 1851, had seen its daily circulation fall to about 9,000, placing it far behind many competitors. Losing thousands of dollars a week, the Gray Lady, as it was known, was on the brink of extinction. Far from the clamor of New York, in the quiet post-Civil War South, the man who would save the Times was learning his trade. Adolph Simon Oakes was the unlikeliest of saviors. He was not a New York insider. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants, a man who had built his life from scratch in Chattanooga, Tennessee. His story is a quintessential American tale of grit and vision. His parents, Julius and Bertha Ochs, had fled anti-Semitism in Bavaria in the 1840s, seeking a life of freedom and opportunity in the New World. They were intellectuals, dreamers, and staunch idealists. Julius was a lay rabbi and teacher who, despite his scholarly nature, struggled to find financial success. During the Civil War, their loyalties were divided in the border state of Tennessee. Julius supported the Union, a dangerous position in the heart of the Confederacy. This experience of living amidst profound division would deeply impress upon their son the value of fairness and finding a common factual ground. Adolph's formal education was brief. At the tender age of 11, the family's precarious finances forced him to seek work. He found it at the bottom rung of the newspaper world, as a printer's devil for the Knoxville Chronicle. It was grueling, ink-stained labor. He swept floors, delivered papers before dawn, and learned the painstaking process of setting type by hand, letter by letter. But in that noisy, chaotic print shop, a fire was lit within him. He was captivated by the magic of turning blank paper into a daily record of human life. He absorbed every aspect of the business, from reporting to advertising to finance. His ambition was immense, far outstripping his modest circumstances. At just 20 years old, in 1878, he undertook an audacious gamble. He borrowed $250 and bought a controlling interest in another failing newspaper, the Chattanooga Times. The city was a wreck, still recovering from the devastation of the Civil War, but Oakes saw potential. While other papers of the day were fiercely partisan and sensational, Ochs charted a different course. He declared that his paper would be independent, devoted to the development of the city, and committed to reporting the news without fear or favor. It was the same philosophy he would later bring to New York, tested and proven in the small-scale laboratory of Chattanooga. He worked tirelessly, and against all odds, he turned the paper into a respected and profitable enterprise. But Chattanooga was never going to be big enough for his dreams. His eyes were fixed on the ultimate prize, New York City. When Adolph Ochs arrived in New York in 1896, he was a complete outsider. In the high-stakes world of New York finance and media, dominated by an established, largely Protestant elite, he was a Southerner, a Jew, and a man of modest means. He had a vision, but he needed capital. The ailing New York Times was in receivership, and its owners were desperate. Ochs saw his chance. He embarked on a relentless campaign to convince the city's financial titans to back his bid. It was a monumental challenge. He was told repeatedly that his plan for a sober, impartial newspaper was doomed to fail in a city addicted to sensationalism. But his earnestness, his clear-headed business plan, and the quiet force of his conviction began to win people over. He secured the funds necessary, including a loan of about $75,000, though there is no documented evidence that J.P. Morgan was among those financial backers. The deal he struck was a testament to his confidence. He invested about $75,000, largely borrowed, to acquire control of the NYT. There's no reliable historical evidence that a formal condition was imposed requiring 3 consecutive profitable years before obtaining full control. It was a high-wire act with no safety net. Failure meant not just financial ruin, but public humiliation. On August 18, 1896, Adolph S. Ochs officially became the publisher and assumed control of the New York Times. The newsroom he walked into was a scene of despair. The equipment was ancient, the staff was demoralized, and the paper's reputation was in tatters. His first act was to publish a declaration of principles on the editorial page, a document that would become the bedrock of the institution. He wrote, "It will be my earnest aim that the New York Times give the news, all the news in concise and attractive form, in language that is parliamentary in good society, and to give the news impartially without fear or favor, regardless of party, sect, or interests involved." Then came the masterstroke. A few months later, a simple, elegant motto appeared for the first time on the masthead, "All the news that's fit to print." It was a brilliant piece of marketing, a direct and devastating critique of his rivals. It was a promise to the reader. We will not insult your intelligence. We will not traffic in scandal and gossip. We will be your trusted source in a world of noise. But a motto alone doesn't save a newspaper. Ochs knew he had to compete on price. In a move that worried his advisors and alarmed some investors, he reduced the Times' price from 3 cents to 1 cent. Some staff feared financial disaster, but Ochs was gambling that there was a silent, underserved market of readers, businessmen, professionals, educated families, who were hungry for a quality paper at an affordable price. The first few years were a desperate struggle. The paper continued to bleed money. Ochs worked around the clock, overseeing every detail, personally lobbying advertisers, and inspiring his staff with his own unwavering belief. He hired a brilliant managing editor, Carl Van Anda, a journalistic prodigy with an encyclopedic mind and an uncanny nose for news. Together they began to transform the paper's content. They expanded business and financial news, invested in unparalleled international coverage, and insisted on a standard of accuracy and depth that was unheard of at the time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. The paper's sober yet comprehensive coverage of the Spanish-American War earned it respect. Readers, tired of the jingoistic hysteria of the other papers, began to switch to the Times. Circulation, which stood at about 9,000 when he took control, gradually rose to tens of thousands following the price cut, for example reaching around 25,000 before climbing further in subsequent years. Advertisers, recognizing the quality of the readership, began to follow. By around 1900, Having achieved multiple years of improved revenues and advertising growth, Ochs was able to secure majority stock ownership. Some sources cite 3 years of profitability as the benchmark for gaining controlling interest. He had not just saved a newspaper, he had launched a revolution in American journalism, proving that integrity could also be good business. With the paper's future secured, he began to solidify his legacy. He moved the Times to a new grand headquarters on a plaza that the city would rename Times Square in his honor. And he began to weave his own family into the fabric of the institution. He brought in his nephew, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, a bright young man who would soon fall in love with and marry Ochs's only child, his beloved daughter, Iphigene. The first stone of the Sulzberger dynasty had been laid, built on the foundation of one man's audacious dream. The era of Ochs had been a stunning success, but it was just the beginning. The challenges that would confront the next generation and the personal demons that would haunt them would be of a different and perhaps even more formidable kind. With Adolph Ochs at the helm and the treacherous currents of yellow journalism held at bay, the New York Times entered its golden age. The paper was no longer just a survivor. It was the standard bearer of a new kind of American journalism, sober, exhaustive, and relentlessly factual. Ochs and his brilliant, almost eccentric managing editor, Carl Van Anda, transformed the newsroom into a temple of information. Van Anda was a legend in his own right, a man who could reputedly read hieroglyphics, spot flaws in Einstein's equations, and possessed a memory so vast it was said he never needed to consult a reference book. Together, Ochs's vision and Van Anda's genius created an unstoppable force. Their triumphs became the stuff of journalistic legend. In April 1912, when the world's most magnificent ocean liner, the RMS Titanic, struck an iceberg on its maiden voyage, the news that reached other papers was confused and contradictory. Many, clinging to the ship's reputation as unsinkable, reported that it was being safely towed to Halifax. But inside the Times newsroom, Van Anda felt a deep sense of unease. He stayed at his post all night, poring over the faint, crackling wireless signals coming from the North Atlantic. He pieced together fragments, cross-referenced shipping logs, and, using his encyclopedic knowledge of naval architecture and rescue protocols, came to a horrifying conclusion long before any official confirmation. Under Van Anda's direction, the Times City edition shifted its front page in the early hours to reflect the worst-case scenario, though whether immense loss of life was stated unequivocally before official confirmation is debated in historical records. It was a staggering journalistic coup, a masterpiece of deduction and nerve that cemented the Times' reputation for getting the story right, no matter how grim. This was not a one-off event. When World War I engulfed Europe, the Times set a new standard for international correspondence, providing its readers with comprehensive, on-the-ground reporting that transcended jingoism and propaganda. When explorers Frederick Cook and Robert Peary both claimed to be the first to reach the North Pole, it was the Times that meticulously investigated their claims, ultimately debunking Cook's as a fraud. The paper became a trusted arbiter of fact in an increasingly complex world. Ochs had built more than a successful business. He had created an institution that people believed in. He saw himself not as a mere owner, but as a trustee. The newspaper, he often said, was a public trust, and his family's role was to safeguard its integrity for the good of the nation. At the center of this burgeoning empire was Adolph Ochs's most cherished treasure, his only child, Iphigene. Born in 1892, she was a child of the newspaper. She grew up with the smell of ink and the clatter of the printing press as the soundtrack of her life. She was not just an heiress, she was brilliant in her own right, with a sharp, inquisitive mind and a deep passion for the world of ideas. She attended the prestigious Barnard College, where she studied history and economics, and she inherited her father's profound sense of civic duty. She was not merely an heiress, she was intelligent and deeply interested in civic affairs. While she held significant influence, historical records do not show that she was formally considered the expected successor. But Adolph Ochs, for all his journalistic progressivism, was a man of his era. The idea of a woman running the country's most important newspaper was, to him, simply unthinkable. He adored his daughter, respected her intellect, but he could not break free from the patriarchal conventions of his time. This decision would create a quiet but persistent tension within the family for decades. Iphigenie would never be the publisher, never hold the title her talents so clearly merited. Instead, she was destined to become something else, something perhaps even more crucial, the uncrowned queen of the dynasty. For the next 60 years, she would serve as the family's conscience, the steadfast keeper of her father's sacred values. While the men in her life, her husband, her son, her grandson, held the official title of publisher, it was often Iphigenie, from her seat on the board of trustees, who provided the moral compass. She was the anchor in every storm, the quiet voice of principle in every difficult decision. Her influence was immense, a powerful undercurrent shaping the destiny of the paper, even if her name never appeared on the masthead. With Iphigenie barred from the top job, the question of succession fell to the man who would win her hand. That man was Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. Born in 1891 to a prominent family of cotton merchants, Arthur was everything Ochs could have hoped for in a son-in-law. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a keen intellect, graduating from Columbia University. He met Iphigenie in 1916, and their connection was immediate and profound. Theirs was a genuine love match, a partnership of equals that would last a lifetime. But their marriage in 1917 was also a dynastic union, the moment the Ochs legacy officially intertwined with the Sulzberger name. Ochs took his son-in-law under his wing, initiating him into the priesthood of the times. It was a long and demanding apprenticeship. Ochs was a formidable mentor, drilling Arthur in every facet of the newspaper's operation, from the press room to the advertising department to the editorial board. The relationship was built on deep mutual respect, but it was also fraught with an unspoken immense pressure. Arthur was constantly in the shadow of a living legend, tasked with one day filling shoes that seemed impossibly large. He was the chosen one, but the path to the throne was paved with the crushing weight of expectation. Just as the Ochs-Sulzberger dynasty seemed to be settling into an era of unparalleled stability and prestige, the world fell apart. The Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt with the stock market crash of 1929, plunging the nation and the world into the Great Depression. The economic devastation was swift and brutal, and the newspaper industry was hit particularly hard. As businesses failed and unemployment soared, advertising, the lifeblood of any newspaper, vanished almost overnight. Papers across the country, many of which had been profitable for decades, began to fold, their presses falling silent one by one. The New York Times was not immune. The institution that had seemed as solid as the granite of its own building was suddenly vulnerable. Advertising revenue plummeted. Ochs, who had spent his life building a fortress of financial independence, was forced to make excruciating decisions. He cut salaries, including his own, and laid off employees. The very survival of the paper, which had seemed so certain just a few years earlier, was once again in question. The crisis placed an almost unbearable strain on the aging patriarch, and his heir apparent. This was the crucible where the hidden cost of leadership began to reveal itself in the most brutal and physical of ways. For Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the pressure was relentless. He was working day and night trying to navigate the financial crisis, while simultaneously managing the expectations of his formidable father-in-law. In 1932, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger reportedly suffered a stress-induced heart attack that affected his left hand. However, sources do not clearly support that it caused permanent paralysis or that he was exactly 41 at the time. It was a terrifying warning, a stark reminder that the responsibility he was destined to inherit could literally kill him. The burden of the Sulzberger name was not just a metaphor, it was a physical affliction. And for Adolf Ochs, the man who had started it all, the depression was the final insurmountable storm. He had built his life on the principles of reason, order, and progress. The chaos and despair of the 1930s seemed to negate everything he had worked for. The financial pressures on the paper weighed on him heavily, but it was more than that. It was the psychological toll of watching the world he knew unravel. In his final years, Ochs faced increasing financial and health pressures, though historical records emphasize physical decline rather than documented psychological breakdowns. He fell into a severe, debilitating depression. The man whose energy had once seemed boundless became withdrawn and listless. He lost interest in the paper, the institution that had been his life's work. By 1935, he was often unable to even come into the office. The titan of journalism was fading, consumed by a private darkness. On April 8, 1935, while visiting his beloved Chattanooga, Adolf Ochs suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. He was 77 years old. The news of his death marked the definitive end of an era. The founding father was gone, and the weight of his entire legacy now fell squarely onto the shoulders of his son-in-law, a man already scarred by the immense pressure of his position. With the passing of Adolf Ochs, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger officially became the second publisher in the Dynasty. He inherited the paper at one of the most perilous moments in modern history. The Great Depression still gripped the nation, and across the Atlantic, the ominous drums of war were growing louder. He had to steer the Gray Lady through the treacherous political landscape of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal at home and confront the rise of fascism abroad. His leadership style was necessarily different from his father-in-law's. Where Ochs had been a hands-on paternalistic proprietor, Sulzberger was more of a modern executive. He delegated authority, empowering a new generation of editors and reporters. He expanded the paper's coverage, adding new sections on arts and leisure, and invested heavily in developing a network of foreign correspondents that would soon become the envy of the world. He was a skilled diplomat and a thoughtful leader, deeply committed to upholding the Ochsian principles of impartiality and integrity. But it was this very commitment, filtered through the complex lens of his own identity as an assimilated American Jew, that would lead the Times to what many now consider its greatest moral failing. As Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, the New York Times covered the story with its characteristic thoroughness. Its Berlin correspondent reported on the escalating persecution of Jews, the book burnings, and the creation of the first concentration camps. Yet as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, and the Nazi regime's persecution escalated into a systematic campaign of extermination, a strange and disturbing pattern emerged in the paper's coverage. The story of the Holocaust, the single greatest atrocity of the 20th century, was consistently, inexplicably downplayed. Stories that should have been on the front page, screaming for the world's attention, were often buried deep inside the paper. relegated to small articles on page 5 or page 10. The word Jew was often avoided, with victims described simply as refugees or persecuted minorities. In 1942, when the World Jewish Congress held a press conference confirming that the Nazis had a plan to annihilate all of Europe's Jews, the Times ran the story on page 10. The systematic murder of millions was treated not as a singular world-shattering crime, but as just another tragic consequence of a brutal war. How could this have happened? How could the newspaper that prided itself on printing all the news that's fit to print, a paper owned by a prominent Jewish family, so profoundly miss the most important story of its time? The question has haunted the family and the institution for decades. There is no simple answer, but rather a complex web of historical context, journalistic convention, and the deeply personal anxieties of Arthur Hayes Sulzberger himself. Sulzberger, like many German-American Jews of his generation, was a staunch assimilationist. He was an American first, a Jew second. He belonged to the school of classical reform Judaism, which viewed Judaism purely as a religion, not a distinct ethnic or national identity. He was deeply uncomfortable with Zionism and any form of Jewish nationalism, fearing it would lead to accusations of dual loyalty. He was acutely, almost painfully aware of the persistent anti-Semitic trope that Jews controlled the media. The last thing he wanted was for the New York Times to be perceived as a Jewish paper. He feared that giving prominent coverage to the suffering of European Jews would be seen as special pleading, as using his powerful platform to advance a parochial Jewish agenda. In a tragically misguided effort to maintain his paper's universal objectivity, he bent over backwards, effectively obscuring the particularity of the Jewish genocide. This personal anxiety was compounded by the journalistic norms of the era. In a time before the 24-hour news cycle, official government sources were given far more weight than reports from refugee organizations or underground resistance movements. While the Times did report the facts that were coming out of Europe, these reports were often couched in cautious language and not given the prominence they deserved because they were not yet confirmed by the Allied governments, who themselves were reluctant to highlight the Jewish question. It was a catastrophic failure of moral imagination born from a complex mix of fear, principle, and journalistic caution. The family that had built its reputation on speaking truth to power fell into a profound silence at the very moment its voice was needed most. This episode remains a deep and painful stain on the paper's legacy, a chilling reminder that even the most principled institutions can have devastating blind spots, and that the promise to print all the news is a far more complicated and ethically fraught mission than it sounds. As the world emerged from the ashes of World War II and the full, unimaginable horror of the Holocaust was revealed, the Sulzberger family and their great newspaper had to confront not only a changed world, but also the ghosts of the stories they had failed to tell. The world that emerged from the rubble of the Second World War was not a world at peace. It was a world fractured, split down the middle by an iron curtain. The era of superpowers had begun, and with it, a new kind of conflict, a Cold War, fought not on traditional battlefields but in the shadows, with spies, propaganda, and the terrifying new logic of nuclear deterrence. Back home in America, this global tension seeped into the national psyche, breeding a culture of fear and suspicion. The Red Scare began to fester, an insidious paranoia that saw communist conspiracies behind every corner. This was the new treacherous landscape that Arthur Hayes Sulzberger and the New York Times had to navigate. The paper's role was more critical than ever. As the United States assumed the mantle of global leadership, the Times became, in effect, the world's newspaper of record. Its network of foreign bureaus, painstakingly rebuilt and expanded after the war, became the eyes and ears of the free world. Its dispatches from Moscow, London, and a newly divided Berlin were required reading not just for the American public, but for presidents and prime ministers. At home, Sulzberger walked a tightrope. He was a staunch anti-communist, a patriot who believed deeply in the American system. Yet, he was also a liberal, a defender of civil liberties, who was deeply troubled by the excesses of the anti-communist crusade. This tension came to a head with the rise of a junior senator from Wisconsin, a brutish, opportunistic demagogue named Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy's campaign of baseless accusations and televised witch hunts terrorized Washington and cast a chilling pall over American life. The Times' approach to McCarthy was a reflection of its institutional caution. It did not perhaps lead the charge against him with the righteous fire of journalists like Edward R. Murrow. Instead, it did what it did best. It reported meticulously, relentlessly, and factually. Day after day, it documented McCarthy's lies, exposed his fabricated evidence, and gave voice to his victims. It was a slow, grinding process of journalistic attrition. The Times didn't land a single knockout blow, but its steady, unblinking coverage provided the irrefutable evidence that, over time, allowed the American public and the political establishment to see McCarthy for the fraud he was, ultimately leading to his censure and downfall. It was a testament to the power of sober, persistent fact in an age of hysteria. While Arthur Hayes Sulzberger wrestled with the great affairs of state, a new generation of the family was coming of age. The question of who would be the third publisher was a matter of quiet but intense speculation within the family, and the presumed heir was not the person you might expect. Arthur and Iphigenie had 4 children, Marion, Ruth, Judith, and their only son, Arthur Ochs-Sulzberger, who was known to everyone by his lifelong nickname, Punch. Growing up, Punch was not the star of the family. He was a bright but unexceptional student, more interested in tinkering with machines than in poring over books. He struggled with dyslexia, a condition not well understood at the time, which made academic pursuits a challenge. Compared to his intellectually gifted sisters, he seemed to lack the gravitas, the scholarly heft that was expected of a future leader of the times. His own mother, the formidable Iphigenie, worried constantly. Punch isn't a brilliant scholar. She would confide in friends, her voice laced with a mother's unique blend of love and anxiety. I just hope he's smart enough. The family's hopes and her husband's seemed to rest more on their talented and charming son-in-law, Orville Dreyfus. Married to their eldest daughter, Marion, Dreyfus was a successful Wall Street stockbroker who had joined the paper at Sulzberger's urging. He was sharp, capable, and universally respected. He seemed to be the perfect candidate to carry the torch, a steady hand to guide the paper into the second half of the 20th century. Punch, it was assumed, would find a different, less demanding role within the family enterprise. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II, serving in the Pacific, and was called back to active duty during the Korean War. He was a soldier, a patriot, a good man, but a publisher. Few, perhaps not even Punch himself, believed it was his destiny. By the early 1960s, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger's health, which had been fragile for decades, began to fail him. The long years of relentless pressure had taken their final toll. In 1961, he officially stepped down, passing the title of publisher to the man he had carefully groomed for the role, his son-in-law, Orville Dreyfus. Dreyfus inherited a paper that was at the height of its prestige, but also one that was facing a new and insidious threat From within, labor unrest. The powerful newspaper unions of New York were flexing their muscles, and the relationship between management and the pressmen, typographers, and drivers had grown increasingly hostile. Just a year into his tenure, in the winter of 1962, Dreyfus was confronted with a crisis that would consume him. A citywide newspaper strike shut down not only the Times but every major daily paper in New York. The strike dragged on for an agonizing 114 days. For nearly 4 months, the city that never sleeps was a city without its daily chronicle. The financial losses were staggering, but for Dreyfus, the psychological toll was even greater. He felt the weight of the entire institution on his shoulders. He negotiated tirelessly, working around the clock, caught between the unyielding demands of the unions and the immense pressure to get his paper back on the streets. The stress was unbearable, a daily siege on his physical and mental health. The strike finally ended in the spring of 1963, but Orville Dreyfus would not recover. The man who had been the picture of vitality just a year earlier was left a broken man. And then the quiet curse of the publisher's chair, the unseen ghost that had haunted his predecessors, came for him. Just weeks after the strike was settled, Orville Dreyfus collapsed. His heart, strained beyond its limits, gave out. He died on May 25, 1963. He was only 50 years old. The news of his sudden death sent a shock wave of grief and terror through the Sulzberger family. It was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The carefully laid plans for succession were in ashes. The man they had all counted on was gone. In the midst of their mourning, they were faced with an urgent, terrifying question. Who would lead now? The family board convened in a state of crisis. The future of the paper, their sacred trust, hung in the balance. All eyes turned, with a mixture of hope and profound apprehension, to the only remaining male heir of his generation, the 37-year-old Marine, the underdog, Arthur Ochs Punch Sulzberger. His coronation was not a moment of triumph. It was an act of desperation. The newsroom was stunned, the outside world skeptical. The consensus was that he was not ready, that he was a lightweight who was being handed the job only because of his name. He was the accidental publisher, a man thrust onto the throne by tragedy. Punch himself would later admit to being utterly terrified. "I was just hoping I wouldn't be the one who blew it," he recalled, his words betraying the deep sense of inadequacy he felt. He was now the captain of the ship, and he was sailing into the stormiest of seas. Everyone underestimated Punch Sulzberger. They saw the affable demeanor, the lack of intellectual pretension, and mistook it for a lack of substance. But they had overlooked the qualities he had forged in the Marine Corps: a quiet toughness, a pragmatic, no-nonsense approach to problem-solving, and an innate ability to inspire loyalty. He didn't have his father's scholarly air or his grandfather's visionary intensity, but he possessed something they lacked: a common touch, a shrewd and instinctive understanding of both people and business. He began by proving the doubters wrong, not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet competence. He surrounded himself with a team of brilliant editors, most notably A.M. Abe Rosenthal, a pugnacious and legendary newsman. He gave them his trust and the freedom to innovate. He began a slow but deliberate modernization of the paper, investing in new technologies and looking for ways to expand its reach and appeal. He recognized that for the Gray Lady to survive, it couldn't just be a sacred trust. It also had to be a thriving, forward-looking business. But it was in 1971 that the accidental publisher would face the defining test of his life, a confrontation that would not only forge his legacy but would alter the course of American history. It was a crisis that would pit the New York Times directly against the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States. The battle was over a mountain of paper, a 7,000-page, top-secret document that would come to be known as the Pentagon Papers. The story began with one man's crisis of conscience. Daniel Ellsberg, a brilliant military analyst who had once been a fervent believer in the Vietnam War, had become deeply disillusioned. Having worked on a top-secret Department of Defense study on the history of the war, he had seen firsthand the decades of deception. The study revealed in excruciating detail how 4 successive presidential administrations, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had systematically and deliberately lied to the American people and to Congress about the scope, the purpose, and the prospects of the war in Vietnam. Haunted by what he knew, Ellsberg made a fateful decision. He would leak the documents. He painstakingly photocopied the thousands of pages and, through a series of clandestine meetings, delivered them to a top reporter at the New York Times, Neil Sheehan. When Sheehan and his editors saw what they had, they knew it was the biggest, most explosive story of their lives. But it was also the most dangerous. The Nixon administration, which was continuing the war, was desperate to keep the documents secret. They warned the Times in the starkest possible terms. Publishing this information would be a violation of the Espionage Act. It would endanger national security. It would be an act of treason. The paper's own prestigious law firm agreed, advising Sulzberger in no uncertain terms not to publish. They warned him that he and his editors could go to jail, and that the government could seek injunctions that would financially cripple the company, potentially forcing the family to sell the paper their grandfather had fought so hard to build. Sulzberger was trapped. On one side was the full weight of the United States government, the threat of prison, and the advice of his own trusted lawyers. On the other were his journalists, led by the passionate Abe Rosenthal, who argued that this was not a matter of treason, but a matter of constitutional duty. The public, they insisted, had a right to know the truth about a war that was tearing the nation apart. The final decision fell to Punch, and Punch alone. For several agonizing days, he wrestled with the choice. It was the ultimate test of everything his family stood for. What was the meaning of all the news that's fit to print if it didn't include the truth about a war that had already cost tens of thousands of American lives? He sought the counsel of his mother, Iphigene, the keeper of the flame. According to family accounts, Iphigene reassured her son by invoking her father's courage. Whether she used those exact words is uncertain, but her support bolstered Punch's resolve. That was all he needed to hear. In a tense meeting with his top executives and lawyers, with the forces of caution arguing for restraint, Sulzberger made the call that would define his life. He looked at his team and said simply, "Publish." On Sunday, June 13, 1971, the first installment of the Pentagon Papers appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The reaction from the White House was volcanic. President Nixon was enraged. The Justice Department rushed to court, and for the first time in American history, the government won a court order imposing prior restraint, forcing a newspaper to stop publishing a story. A court order temporarily halted further publication, but the story was now out. Ellsberg leaked copies of the papers to the Washington Post, led by its own formidable publisher, Katharine Graham. The Post began publishing, and they too were hit with an injunction. The battle escalated, a high-stakes constitutional drama that raced all the way to the Supreme Court. In the landmark case of New York Times Company versus United States, the court delivered a resounding 6-3 decision in favor of the newspapers. The government, the justices ruled, had not met the heavy burden required to justify censoring the press. It was a monumental victory for the First Amendment, a powerful affirmation of the press's role as a watchdog, not a lapdog, of government. In that moment, Arthur Ochs Sulzberger was transformed. The accidental publisher, the man who doubted himself, had become a titan. He risked much: his reputation, possible legal sanctions, and the family's standing. He had proven not only that he was smart enough, but that he had the one quality that mattered most: guts. The Gray Lady was no longer just a newspaper of record. She was a fighter, a champion of the people's right to know, and her prestige and influence soared to unimaginable new heights, all thanks to the quiet man who had never been expected to lead. The victory in the Pentagon Papers case was more than just a legal triumph. It was a coronation. In the eyes of the world, Arthur Ochs Sulzberger had transformed from a reluctant heir into a fearless defender of the First Amendment. The New York Times, once the staid Gray Lady, was now seen as a crusading force, a powerful check on the excesses of government. Its authority was at an all-time high, its newsroom energized, its place in the pantheon of great American institutions secure. In the years that followed, the paper's relentless reporting on the Watergate scandal, in tandem with the groundbreaking work of the Washington Post, would help bring down a corrupt presidency, further cementing its reputation as an indispensable pillar of democracy. But Sulzberger was a pragmatist. He knew that prestige, no matter how immense, could not pay the salaries of his reporters or the cost of the newsprint his papers were printed on. The near-death experience of the 1962 newspaper strike had taught him a harsh lesson. A newspaper that was not financially robust was a newspaper that was vulnerable. He recognized that the Times, for all its editorial greatness, was a dangerously old-fashioned business. It was a dense, intimidating two-section behemoth, beloved by political junkies and Wall Street titans, but increasingly out of touch with the lives of ordinary educated Americans. To secure the dynasty for his children, he would have to do more than just protect the paper's principles. He would have to reinvent its business. This began what can only be called the quiet revolution of the Punch era. He envisioned a newspaper that was not just a morning briefing, but an essential companion for modern life. The idea was radical, and to many in the newsroom, borderline heretical. He wanted to break the paper out of its hard news ghetto and introduce new daily sections, dedicated to what his more traditionalist editors derisively called fluff. Starting in the late 1970s, the paper was systematically transformed. Monday brought Sports Monday, offering in-depth analysis beyond the weekend's scores. Tuesday introduced Science Times, a groundbreaking section that made complex scientific discoveries accessible to a lay audience. Wednesday was for Living, later Dining, which tapped into the burgeoning foodie culture. Thursday brought Home, with its focus on design and real estate. And Friday offered Weekend, a guide to the arts and entertainment of the city. The resistance from the newsroom, led by the formidable editor Abe Rosenthal, was Bierce. They saw it as a dilution of the paper's serious mission, a capitulation to frivolous consumerism. But Punch, with his characteristic quiet resolve, pushed the changes through. He understood something his brilliant editors did not. These new sections were not a replacement for serious news. They were a gateway to it. And more importantly, they were a goldmine. They attracted a vast new universe of advertisers, department stores, real estate brokers, restaurants, movie studios, who had never before seen the Times as a viable place for their marketing dollars. The new revenue streams were enormous, providing the financial cushion that would fund the paper's expensive foreign bureaus and ambitious investigative reporting for decades to come. But his ambition was bigger than New York. He dreamed of transforming the Times from a great metropolitan daily into America's only truly national newspaper. This was an immense logistical and financial undertaking. In a pre-internet age, it meant building a network of satellite printing plants across the country, from California to Illinois to Florida. It was a gamble that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but it paid off spectacularly. For the first time, a reader in Los Angeles or Chicago could have the same morning paper delivered to their doorstep as a reader in Manhattan. To fund this massive expansion, Punch made another crucial decision. In 1969, he took the company public, listing it on the American Stock Exchange. To outsiders, it might have looked like a dilution of the family's power, but it was, in fact, the move that would guarantee its perpetuation. The public offering was structured with a dual-class stock system. The Sulzberger family would hold a special class of B shares, which carried immense voting rights, while the public would buy A shares with limited voting power. This ingenious financial architecture allowed the family to raise vast sums of capital from the public markets while ensuring that their control over the company, and especially over its editorial direction, could never be threatened by a hostile takeover or an activist investor. It was the masterstroke that firewalled the newsroom from the demands of Wall Street, securing the Ochs-Sulzberger dynasty for the generations to come. As Punch Sulzberger was busy reinventing the newspaper, a new heir was being carefully groomed to take his place. His son, Arthur Ochs-Sulzberger Jr., born in 1951, had an upbringing that was the mirror opposite of his father's. Where Punch was the accidental publisher, Arthur Jr. was the designated one. His path to the throne was not left to chance. It was meticulously planned. He was a product of a new generation. He grew up not in the shadow of the Great Depression, but in the crucible of the 1960s. He protested the Vietnam War, the very war his father's newspaper had so courageously exposed. He was more overtly intellectual than his father, more progressive in his social views, and keenly aware of the changing cultural currents in America. After graduating from Tufts University, he began his journalistic apprenticeship far from the august halls of the Times, working as a reporter for the Raleigh Times in North Carolina and the Associated Press in London. He was learning the trade from the ground up, just as his great-grandfather had. He joined the New York Times in 1978, working his way through a variety of roles: reporter in the Washington Bureau, editor on the Metro desk, and eventually crucial stints on the business side in advertising and corporate planning. The father-son dynamic was complex. Punch was immensely proud, but he was also a tough, demanding boss. He was determined that his son would earn the top job, not just inherit it. For Arthur Jr., it was a long, often grueling process of proving himself to a living legend, of demonstrating that he was worthy of the sacred trust. Finally, in 1992, Punch Sulzberger, then 66 years old, decided the time was right. He stepped down as publisher, passing the torch to his 40-year-old son. He would remain as chairman of the company for another 5 years, a watchful patriarch, ensuring a smooth transition. Arthur Jr. inherited a newspaper at the peak of its powers. It was editorially dominant, financially robust, and more influential than ever. The kingdom was secure, the dynasty intact. But on the distant horizon, unseen by almost everyone in the grand, wood-paneled offices of the Times, a tsunami was forming. A technological revolution was brewing that would not just challenge the newspaper industry, but would threaten to sweep it away entirely. It began as a novelty, a curiosity: the Internet. In the mid-1990s, it was a slow, clunky world of dial-up connections and primitive websites. For the titans of the newspaper industry, including those at the Times, it seemed like a toy, a playground for tech geeks and academics, certainly not a serious threat to their centuries-old business model. Their power was built on massive printing presses, fleets of delivery trucks, and a near monopoly on the distribution of information. The idea that people would one day abandon the tangible, authoritative heft of a daily newspaper for a flickering screen seemed preposterous. In 1996, under Arthur Jr.'s leadership, the New York Times launched its first website, nytimes.com. Following the prevailing wisdom of the day, they made a decision that would, in hindsight, prove to be almost fatal. They gave their content away for free. The strategy seemed logical at the time. Build a massive online audience, the thinking went, and the advertising dollars will surely follow. It was the same model that had worked in print for 100 years. But the digital world operated by a completely different set of rules. As the 2000s dawned, the digital tsunami hit with full force. The slow creep of dial-up was replaced by the flood of high-speed broadband, and with it came a series of disruptive forces that systematically dismantled the newspaper's financial fortress. First came Craigslist, the simple online bulletin board that single-handedly vaporized the classified advertising market, a section that, for decades, had been a river of gold for newspapers, funding everything from foreign bureaus to investigative projects. Then came Google and Facebook, tech behemoths that grew to dominate the digital advertising landscape, using sophisticated algorithms to target users with an efficiency that newspapers could never hope to match. Simultaneously, a new wave of blogs, news aggregators, and social media platforms shattered the Times' control over distribution. Suddenly, anyone with a keyboard could be a publisher. The news cycle, once dictated by the rhythms of the morning and evening editions, accelerated to a dizzying 24/7 pace. The authority of the Gray Lady was being challenged by a million different voices, many of them fast, free, and often unburdened by old-fashioned notions of fact-checking and editorial standards. For Arthur Sulzberger Jr., it was a nightmare. The rock-solid institution he had inherited was crumbling beneath his feet. Print circulation began a slow, inexorable decline. Print advertising revenue, the bedrock of the company, began to collapse. The financial crisis of 2008 accelerated the trend, turning a decline into a freefall. The company's stock price, which had peaked at over $50 a share, plummeted to less than $4. The Ochs-Sulzberger family's immense fortune, nearly all of it tied up in that stock, was evaporating. The dynasty was on the verge of ruin. The pressure on Arthur Jr. was unimaginable. He became the public face of the newspaper industry's failure to adapt. Critics, both inside and outside the company, savaged his leadership. The newsroom, steeped in tradition, was resistant to the painful changes that were needed. And now, the family itself began to fracture. For the first time in a century, the younger generation of Sulzbergers, watching their inheritance vanish, began to ask the unthinkable question, should we sell? The crisis reached its nadir in 2009. Desperate for a cash infusion to stave off bankruptcy, the company was forced to accept what many saw as a humiliating bailout. They took a $250 million loan from the Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim, but the terms were punishing with an interest rate of over 14%. The deal saved the company from immediate collapse, but the symbolism was devastating. The fiercely independent New York Times, the paper that had stood up to presidents and governments, was now beholden to an outside tycoon. The rumors grew to a fever pitch. The family's long reign was finally over. Arthur Jr. was not just fighting to save a business. He was fighting to save his family's soul. battling against the perception that he was the one who would lose the kingdom. In the darkest days of the crisis, a new voice began to emerge from within the family. Arthur Gregg, A.G. Sulzberger, Arthur Jr.'s son, represented the fifth generation of the dynasty. He was a journalist like his father and had worked as a reporter at the papers bureaus in the Midwest. He understood the digital world not as a threat, but as a native language. It became increasingly clear that the strategy of giving away journalism for free online, hoping to subsist on digital advertising, was a path to oblivion. A new radical strategy was needed. In 2011, after years of agonizing debate, Arthur Jr. made the biggest and riskiest bet of his career. He put the content of nytimes.com behind a metered paywall. Readers would get a certain number of articles for free each month, but after that, they would have to pay. The move was widely derided. Media analysts predicted its spectacular failure. The conventional wisdom was that people had become too accustomed to getting their news for free online. They would never pay. It was a gamble on a single core belief that the quality of the journalism produced by the New York Times was so distinctive, so valuable, that people would be willing to open their wallets for it. At the same time, the company was undergoing a painful process of internal reckoning. In 2014, a newsroom innovation team, including Arthur Gregg, A.G. Sulzberger, produced an internal report called the Innovation Report that candidly examined the Times' challenges in adapting its culture, digital strategy, and operational practices. When it was leaked to the public, it sent shockwaves through the industry. The report was a cri de coeur, a scathing indictment of the paper's slow, print-centric culture. It admitted that the Times was failing to keep pace with digitally native competitors, that its journalists were not rewarded for digital innovation, and that it needed a profound cultural shift towards becoming a digital-first organization. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, but also one of incredible courage. The report was the catalyst for a radical transformation. The company began to invest heavily in digital products, from podcasts to video to cooking and games apps. The newsroom culture began to shift, embracing the internet not as a secondary platform, but as the primary way it reached its audience. And the paywall gamble began to work. The growth was slow at first, but it was steady. Digital subscriptions rose sharply, from several 100,000 in the early years of the paywall to over 1 million, and then climbing further in subsequent years. A new and reliable revenue stream was born, one that was dependent not on the fickle advertising market, but on a direct relationship with the reader. It was a glimmer of hope, a path out of the wilderness. The Sulzberger family, battered, bruised, and profoundly humbled by a decade of crisis, was not just surviving. They were building the foundation for a new kind of future, one they hoped would secure their dynasty for another 100 years. But the political storms of the 21st century would soon test their resolve in ways they could never have imagined. Out of the ashes of the digital apocalypse, a new strategy was born. The decision to bet the company's future on a digital paywall was more than just a business move. It was a profound philosophical shift. For over a century, the primary customer of the New York Times had been the advertiser. The reader was the product, their attention sold to corporations. But now, in a radical return to its roots, the paper declared that its most important relationship was with its readers. The new mission was simple and revolutionary: create journalism so vital, so original, and so indispensable that people would pay for it directly. This subscription-first model fundamentally changed the DNA of the institution. It created a powerful incentive not for clicks and sensationalism, but for quality. The path to survival lay not in chasing fleeting viral trends, but in doubling down on the very things that had always made the Times great: deep investigative reporting, unparalleled international coverage, and authoritative analysis. It was the Oxian principle of all the news that's fit to print, reborn and retooled for the 21st century. Under the leadership of Arthur Sulzberger Jr., and with the digital native vision of his son A.G., the company began its remarkable turnaround. The goal, once a seemingly impossible dream, was to reach 10 million digital subscribers. That number became the company's North Star, guiding every decision. They began to think beyond the article, expanding the definition of what a newspaper could be. They launched The Daily, a morning news podcast that, with its high production values and intimate storytelling, became a cultural phenomenon, downloaded by millions every day. They invested in video journalism, interactive graphics, and newsletters that built personal connections with their audience. Recognizing that subscribers came for more than just politics, they diversified. They acquired The Athletic, a subscription-based sports media company, to dominate a vertical they had never fully captured. And in a move that surprised many, they purchased Wordle, the simple, addictive word game that had become a global sensation. They were no longer just a newspaper company. They were transforming into a multifaceted digital media company, a bundle of essential daily habits for the curious and informed. Amidst this whirlwind of innovation, the final, inevitable transition of the dynasty took place. In late 2017, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., after a quarter century at the helm, a tenure defined by navigating the near death of his industry, stepped down as publisher. He passed the sacred trust to his 37-year-old son, Arthur Gregg Sulzberger, known as A.G. This was not a transition born of crisis, like his father's or grandfather's. It was a planned, deliberate handover to a new generation. A G was the digital native, the man who had authored the innovation report that served as the blueprint for the company's revival. He embodied the future. Yet for all the planning, the weight of the legacy was no lighter. In fact, A.G. had once confessed that he hesitated to even pursue a career in journalism, precisely because of the suffocating pressure of his family name. He had seen what the job had done to his predecessors. He knew the psychological toll, the relentless public scrutiny, the constant fear of being the one to blow it. The curse of the publisher's chair was a very real presence in his mind. But the call of duty, the pull of the institution his family had served for 5 generations, was ultimately too strong to resist. He accepted the mantle, knowing full well the storms that lay ahead. He would not have to wait long for them to arrive. A G. Sulzberger took command at the very moment American society seemed to be coming apart at the seams. The 2016 election of Donald J. Trump was a political earthquake that sent shockwaves through the entire media establishment, and the New York Times was at the epicenter. Like most mainstream outlets, the paper's reporters and pollsters had confidently predicted a Hillary Clinton victory. Trump's win was not just a failure of prediction. It was seen by many as a fundamental failure to understand the anger and anxieties of a huge swath of the American electorate. The paper immediately found itself under siege from all sides. To Trump and his supporters, the Times was the embodiment of the fake news media, a hopelessly biased elite institution that had done everything in its power to stop their movement. The president-elect and later president made the failing New York Times a favorite target in his rallies and on his Twitter feed, a relentless campaign of delegitimization that was unprecedented in American history. At the same time, many on the left furiously criticized the paper for what they saw as its complicity in Trump's rise, particularly its obsessive, often breathless, coverage of Hillary Clinton's email server, a story that dominated the campaign in its final weeks. Into this maelstrom stepped the new young publisher. One of his first significant acts was to accept an invitation to an off-the-record meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. It was a classic Times move, an attempt to open a channel of communication to engage even with their fiercest critic. But the old rules of engagement no longer applied. Trump soon went on Twitter, misrepresenting their private conversation to his millions of followers. In response, Ochs-Sulzberger did something a publisher of the Times had never done before. He broke the off-the-record agreement and released a public statement correcting the president. He revealed that he had used the meeting to deliver a stark warning. He had told the president directly that his rhetoric was not just divisive, but increasingly dangerous, and that his labeling of journalists as the enemy of the people was contributing to a rise in threats against reporters and would lead to violence. It was a stunning public rebuke, a declaration that the fifth-generation leader of the Times would not be bullied. It set the tone for what would become a 4-year war of attrition between the presidency and the press. The effect of Trump's attacks was deeply paradoxical. While they eroded trust in the media among his supporters, they had the opposite effect on his opponents. A massive surge in digital subscriptions, which came to be known as the Trump bump, began to flood into the Times. For millions of Americans who felt that democracy and the very concept of truth were under assault, subscribing to the New York Times became more than just a consumer choice. It was an act of resistance, a statement of civic duty. This created a profound and deeply uncomfortable dilemma for the Sulzberger family. The very political polarization that was tearing the country apart was, in a purely business sense, saving their newspaper. Their financial revival was being fueled by their role as the perceived opposition to a sitting president. For an institution founded on the principle of impartiality, of being a paper for all, this was a dangerous and precarious position. How do you maintain your commitment to objectivity when your newfound financial success is inextricably linked to the perception that you have taken a side? This was the central crisis that would define Ochs-Sulzberger's early tenure, a crisis that would soon erupt not just outside the paper but from within its own walls. The war with the White House was visible and noisy, but a quieter, more complex battle was being fought over the soul of the newspaper itself. The very definition of journalistic objectivity, the core principle upon which Adolf Ochs had built his empire, was coming under intense scrutiny, not just from critics, but from the Times' own journalists. Some audience surveys and analyses show that NYT readers tend to lean Democratic or independent more than Republican. Exact percentages vary among studies. The paper that aspired to be a national institution was increasingly becoming the trusted voice for only one half of a bitterly divided country. This was a source of deep concern for Ochs-Sulzberger, who spoke often about the need to understand the other half of America. But the challenge ran deeper than just the readership. The culture of the newsroom itself was changing. The rise of social media, particularly Twitter, had transformed reporters from anonymous bylines into public personalities. Many journalists now had their own brands, their own followers, and their own outspoken political voices. The traditional wall between reporting and opinion, once sacrosanct, was becoming porous. A new generation of journalists, more diverse and more attuned to issues of social justice, began to question the old model of both sides journalism. They argued that to be truly moral, journalism couldn't just be objective. It had to have a point of view, especially on issues like racial inequality and human rights. Was it a journalist's job To simply report that the sky was blue, or was it also their job to fight back against those who insisted it was green? This simmering internal tension boiled over into a full-blown crisis in the summer of 2020. America was in turmoil. The murder of George Floyd by a police officer had ignited a massive wave of protests against racial injustice across the country. Amidst this tense and volatile atmosphere, the Times' opinion section published a guest essay by a sitting Republican Senator, Tom Cotton, under the headline, "Send in the Troops." The op-ed argued that the president should invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy the U.S. military to quell the protests, some of which had turned violent. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. But it came not just from outraged readers. It came from inside the New York Times building. In an unprecedented act of open rebellion, dozens of the paper's own journalists took to Twitter in protest. Using a coordinated phrase, they declared that publishing the op-ed puts Black at NY Times staff members in danger. It was a mutiny. The paper's own employees were publicly accusing their editors of endangering their colleagues and amplifying dangerous fascistic rhetoric. The leadership was caught completely off guard. Ochs-Sulzberger and the paper's opinion editor, James Bennett, initially defended the decision, falling back on the traditional liberal principle of exposing readers to a wide range of viewpoints, even those they found repellent. But the internal revolt was too powerful to contain. After days of intense internal and external pressure, the paper buckled. It appended a lengthy editor's note to the op-ed, stating that it had not met their standards, and James Bennett, the man who had been seen as a potential successor to the top editor role, was forced to resign. For critics on the right, the Tom Cotton affair was the ultimate proof that the Times had been completely captured by a radical progressive ideology, abandoning its commitment to open debate. For many journalists and readers on the left, it was a necessary and moral correction, a refusal to allow the paper's platform to be used to incite state violence. For the Sulzberger family, it was a watershed crisis. It pitted their foundational belief in the free exchange of ideas against a new and powerful moral clarity embraced by their own staff. The ground was shifting beneath their feet, and the old rules no longer seemed to apply. This was not an isolated incident. The paper's ambitious 1619 project, which sought to reframe American history around the consequences of slavery, earned a Pulitzer Prize but also drew fierce criticism from some of the nation's most respected historians, who accused it of factual inaccuracies and of pushing an ideological agenda. Once again, the Times found itself at the heart of the nation's raging culture wars. The Oxian ideal of a dispassionate, objective newspaper standing above the political fray seemed like a relic from a bygone era. Ochs-Sulzberger was now grappling with a question that would have been unimaginable to his great-great-grandfather. In a world where the very nature of truth is contested, what does it mean to print all the news that's fit to print? And what happens when your own journalists and your own readers can no longer agree on what is naked? The family had successfully navigated the financial crisis of the digital age, only to find themselves in the midst of a profound philosophical one. And so the kingdom was saved. After a decade teetering on the brink of financial oblivion, the New York Times, under the new steady hand of Ochs-Sulzberger, had not just survived the digital age, it had conquered it. By the mid-2020s, it stood as a titan in a landscape of ruins. As hundreds of local newspapers across America withered and died, creating vast news deserts and leaving communities uninformed, the Times thrived, its global subscriber base swelling to over 10 million paying readers. It had become a digital Goliath, a rare and spectacular success story in a beleaguered industry. The company's ambition, now unconstrained by geography, had become global. A Sulzberger's vision was not just to be America's newspaper of record, but to be the single essential subscription for every curious English-speaking person on the planet. From its world-renowned coverage of the war in Ukraine to its in-depth investigations into climate change, the Times was setting a global agenda, its influence reaching further than Adolf Ochs could ever have dreamed. But the family's quiet curse, the immense psychological toll of leadership, had not been vanquished by financial success. In many ways, it had only intensified, taking on a new modern form. The financial pressure that had nearly broken his father had eased for AG, but it was replaced by a different, more insidious kind of strain. He now presided over a global media company that was also a permanent fixture in the crosshairs of the world's most toxic political and cultural battles. The life of the modern publisher was one of perpetual siege. It meant dealing with the constant barrage of online attacks, not just from anonymous trolls, but from the most powerful people in the world. It meant managing the constant threat of sophisticated cyber attacks from hostile nations. It meant navigating the complex dynamics of a newsroom where every journalist had a public voice on Twitter, and internal disagreements could instantly become global news. And above all, it meant carrying the immense moral weight of deciding how to cover a world in a state of seemingly permanent crisis, pandemics, democratic backsliding, ecological collapse. The pressure was no longer about meeting payroll. It was about trying to hold the center in a world that seemed determined to fly apart. The great irony of the Sulzberger dynasty is that after 5 generations of fighting to secure their independence, they found themselves in an age where true independence is not a fortress one can inhabit, but a battle that must be fought anew every single day. The story of the Ochs-Sulzberger clan is in the end a story of profound contradictions. In a democracy, is it right for a single unelected family to control one of our most vital sources of information? The question is troubling. Yet history shows this very dynastic control is what saved the New York Times. In an age where corporate raiders have gutted newspapers for profit, the Sulzberger family's stubborn refusal to sell has been the institution's salvation. It is what allowed them to risk everything on the Pentagon Papers and endure a decade of losses to build the digital model that ultimately saved them. The family's control is both the paper's greatest vulnerability and its most undeniable strength. Their core struggle was the unending pursuit of their own ideal, all the news that's fit to print. The family's history proves that perfect objectivity may be a myth. The paper's tragic failure to cover the Holocaust stemmed from personal anxiety. Its modern battles over bias reflect a polarized nation where even the choice of what story to tell is a political act. Their story is not one of flawless victory, but of a century-long fight to find a common factual ground in a world determined to tear it apart. And in the end, this is still a story about a family. They saved their kingdom, reaching over 10 million subscribers and securing their influence for a new century. But the ghost story mentioned at the beginning never truly ended. The immense psychological toll, the curse of the publisher's chair, was passed down through generations. They wielded a power few royal houses could dream of, the power to shape the first rough draft of history. But the price was paid in sleepless nights, broken health, and private anguish. They were a dynasty built not on certainty, but on a perpetual exhausting quest for an elusive truth, a story filled with all the triumphs and tragedies that are, in the end, fit to print.